My father's hand closed around my right wrist so fast I didn't have time to pull away, and the sound that came out of me when he wrenched it wasn't something I recognized as my own voice. The pain arrived in two distinct waves. The first, a white electric shock that ran straight up through the surgical pins still holding my third and fourth metacarpals together. And the second, slower and worse, the specific horror of understanding, even through the haze of it, exactly how much damage he might have just undone. 6 months of rebuilding, 2 surgeries, a hand I had spent every waking hour since the accident trying, with a desperation I hadn't let myself name out loud, to say. "Sign it," my father said, still gripping my wrist, his voice flat and utterly without apology, as though he were correcting a clerical error rather than crushing his own son's hand against a rehabilitation clinic's exam table. This has gone on long enough. Behind him, my occupational therapist had already frozen mid-step, her clipboard halfway raised, her face shifting from professional composure into something closer to alarm. My Emma was standing by the doorway with her phone already lifted, the small red recording light glowing steadily in the corner of the screen, because Emma had stopped trusting my father to behave like a reasonable person somewhere around month 4 of this, and had quietly started recording every visit he made to my recovery appointments without telling either of us she was doing it. "Get off him," Emma said, and there was nothing shaking in her voice at all. My father let go. He stepped back, glancing once at Emma's phone, and something in his face went carefully, deliberately blank, the same expression he'd worn his entire life whenever a decision he'd already made ran into an inconvenient witness. Was already moving toward the wall phone. Somewhere down the hallway, I could hear the ordinary sounds of the clinic continuing on without us. Another patient laughing at something a therapist said. A cartwheel squeaking against the linoleum. The whole indifferent machinery of an ordinary afternoon that had, for me, just violently stopped being ordinary at all. My name is Cole. I'm 31 years old, and until the afternoon my father tried to force a pen into my ruined right hand, I believed that whatever distance had grown between us over the years was simply the ordinary friction of a father and son who wanted different things from life, not something either of us would ever let curdle into this. I was wrong about that in ways I am still, honestly, learning to sit with. But to understand exactly how a man could grab his own son's surgically repaired hand hard enough to require an emergency evaluation, you have to go back to a fishing boat on the Georgia coast, decades before I was born. My grandfather, Frank Cole, nearly drowned when he was 22 years old. He'd been running his own small charter out of Savannah's waterfront, working the shrimp trawlers before that, and one October afternoon a rogue wave off island put him under long enough that by the time another boat pulled him out, his heart had stopped twice on the way to shore. The young doctor who worked on him in the back of that boat, no formal equipment, nothing but training and stubbornness, kept him alive for the 11 minutes it took to reach the dock. My grandfather never forgot that man's name or the particular, unglamorous competence of his hands working over him in the dark. He used to say that he could still feel the exact pressure of those hands against his chest, decades later, whenever he closed his eyes on a quiet night. He built Cole's Catch 2 years later, a modest seafood restaurant on the same waterfront where he'd nearly died, and he ran it for the next 50 years with a kind of ferocious, grateful devotion, as though every plate he served was some small repayment on a debt he could never fully settle. By the time I was born, it was a Savannah institution, 3 generations deep, my father having taken it over from Frank in his own turn, my younger brother Tucker being groomed, from what felt like the moment he could walk, to take it over from our father eventually. Nobody groomed me for anything. I think, looking back, that my grandfather understood something about me early that my father never quite let himself see. I spent my childhood summers at the restaurant the way Tucker did, bussing tables, learning to shuck oysters fast enough to keep up with a Friday night rush. But what I actually loved about those afternoons wasn't the restaurant itself. It was watching my grandfather, in his 70s by then, tell that same story about the doctor on the boat to anyone who'd sit still long enough to hear it, his voice going soft and almost reverent in a way it never went for anything else. "That man's hands," he'd say, "were the most useful thing I ever saw in my life. More useful than this whole restaurant. Don't ever let anybody tell you different." I decided, sometime around 14, that I wanted hands like that. My father decided, at roughly the same time, that this was a betrayal he would spend the next 2 decades periodically reminding me of. I remember one particular Saturday with a clarity that has never quite faded, the way certain small afternoons end up carrying more weight than they should. I was 15, working the raw bar during a dinner rush, when a regular customer 2 tables over began choking badly on a piece of shrimp, really choking. The silent, panicked kind that doesn't announce itself the way people think it will. I don't fully remember deciding to move. I remember my hands finding the right position almost on their own, some half-remembered lifeguard training taking over completely, and the piece of shrimp coming loose on the second thrust. My grandfather found me afterward, sitting on an overturned bucket by the walk-in, still shaking, and instead of praising the restaurant's quick response the way my father did to every table nearby that had witnessed it, he crouched down in front of me and said quietly, "That's it, right there. That's the thing I've been telling you about. You didn't think. Your hands just knew what to do. Don't you dare let anybody talk you out of chasing that for the rest of your life." My father, when the story reached him later that evening, patted me on the shoulder once and said, "Good work," in the same flat tone he used for a well-poured beer, before turning to ask whether we'd need to reorder shrimp before the dinner rush. I didn't understand yet, at 15, how clearly that single evening had already sorted the two men in my life into two entirely different categories. "You're going to let the Cole name die on that sign," he told me, the night I informed my parents I'd been accepted to medical school instead of the hospitality management program he'd assumed, without ever actually asking me, that I'd apply to alongside Tucker. "Your grandfather built this with his hands, and you're going to walk away from it to go be one more doctor in a hospital full of them." "Grandpa's the one who told me to do it," I said, which was true, and which my father chose, for the rest of his life, to simply never acknowledge as true. Tucker, 3 years younger than me, stepped smoothly into the role I'd vacated, and something in my father seemed to relax the moment he did. A tension I hadn't fully registered until it was gone, replaced by a warmth I recognized, with a familiar dull ache, as the exact warmth I'd spent my whole adolescence trying and failing to earn. Tucker was easy for our father to love in the specific way that people are easy to love when they want precisely what you already wanted for them. By 25, he had the title of general manager and an easy, practiced charm with the regulars that made our father's chest visibly swell with pride at every family dinner I still, out of some stubborn hope, kept attending. I didn't know, for most of those years, that Tucker's charm extended into rooms our father never saw, poker games in the back of a bar 3 blocks off the waterfront, and eventually, further afield, private tables at a casino 2 hours up the coast. Losses that started small enough to absorb quietly and grew, over several years, into something that would eventually require considerably more than quiet to fix. My grandfather died the winter I finished my surgical residency, quietly, in his sleep, in the small apartment above the restaurant he'd never once considered leaving. At the reading of his will, my father sat very still while the attorney explained the terms of a trust Frank had established years earlier and never mentioned to any of us. A fund, modest but not insignificant, divided evenly between Tucker and me, with a note attached in my grandfather's own handwriting specifying that my portion was to be used, whenever I was ready, for whatever kind of help you decide this town still needs. You'll know it when you see it, the way I knew that doctor's hands were worth everything I had. I didn't touch the money. I'd already started imagining, in the vague way you imagine things you're not ready to commit to yet, a small community trauma clinic somewhere near the waterfront, something bearing my grandfather's name, something built out of the same debt he'd spent his life trying to repay. I told my father this once at a dinner not long after the will was settled, and watched his face do the same careful, controlled thing it had done the night I told him about medical school. "That money should go toward the restaurant," he said. "Tucker's expanding the dining room, we could use the capital." "It's not restaurant money, Dad," Grandpa was specific. "Grandpa," my father said, in a tone that made it clear exactly how much weight he thought that word should carry against his own wishes, "isn't here to decide anymore." The subject came up again, more publicly, at my aunt's 60th birthday dinner the following year. A table of nearly 20 relatives, my father a few glasses of wine into the evening, and considerably less careful than usual about keeping family business behind closed doors. "You know," he said, loudly enough that half the table turned, Here is sitting on a small fortune from Frank, saving it for some clinic that doesn't even have a building yet, while his own brother's trying to keep the family name on the waterfront. A few relatives murmured something noncommittal. My aunt, to her credit, tried to change the subject. My father didn't let her. I just think it's interesting is all. What people decide is worth protecting. I remember Emma's hand finding mine under the table, and I remember deciding, somewhere in that silence, that I was done explaining myself to a room that had already made up its mind about what kind of son I was. The pressure over the following 2 years arrived the way pressure in my family always arrived, quietly at first, dressed up as concern, sharpening only once it became clear that concern alone wasn't going to move me. My father began mentioning, at every family gathering, how tight things had gotten at the restaurant, how a renovation loan Tucker had taken out to expand the dining room had come in a bit higher than projected, how it really would mean so much to everyone if I just consider releasing my portion of the trust early to help cover the gap. I noticed in that period that Tucker himself rarely joined those conversations directly. He'd sit at the far end of the table during family dinners, unusually quiet for a man who'd built an entire career on charm, occasionally checking his phone with an expression I mistook, at the time, for simple stress about the business. Once at my mother's birthday dinner, I asked him directly how the expansion was actually going, and he gave me an answer so smooth and specific sounding: contractor delays, a permitting issue with the city, supply costs on imported tile, that I didn't think to question it again for months. I understand now that he'd had that answer rehearsed for exactly this purpose. The same easy fluency he'd always had with customers turned, without my noticing, into fluency at managing his own family. What none of us said out loud yet, because none of us except Tucker actually knew it yet, was that the gap wasn't really about renovation costs at all. I was driving home from a night shift, 4 months ago, when a driver running a red light at nearly 50 miles an hour struck the passenger side of my car with enough force to spin it twice before it came to rest against a guardrail. I remember very little of the immediate aftermath, the sound mostly, a shattering, compressing crunch that I would later learn, professionally, was the specific signature of a T-bone collision at that speed. What I remember clearly is waking up in the trauma bay of the hospital I worked in myself, recognizing two of the nurses treating me, and looking down at my right hand to find it bent at an angle no hand is supposed to bend, 3 fingers visibly, catastrophically wrong. I'd shattered my third and fourth metacarpals and dislocated my wrist badly enough to tear ligaments that would require 2 separate surgeries to repair. The trauma surgeon who operated on me, a colleague I'd scrubbed in with dozens of times, told me afterward, with the particular gentleness doctors reserve for delivering news to other doctors, that I would likely regain most of my hand's function eventually, but that the fine, precise dexterity required for the surgical work I'd built my career on was, realistically, not something anyone could promise me back. I spent the first several weeks after that conversation in a kind of numb, professional denial, the same clinical distance I'd trained myself to use with frightened patients, turned now on myself. Emma, an occupational therapist herself, understood exactly what I was doing and refused, gently but persistently, to let me do it alone. She moved into my apartment the week I came home from the hospital, without either of us discussing it as a decision, simply because it was obviously what needed to happen. And she sat beside me through the worst of the early rehabilitation sessions with a steadiness that made me understand, more clearly than I ever had before, the difference between people who love you and people who love what you can do for them. The early sessions were, without exaggeration, some of the worst weeks of my life. Would have me try to close my hand around a small rubber ball, and I would watch my own fingers refuse to cooperate with a stubbornness that felt almost personal. Some cruel joke my own body was playing on the 12 years I'd spent training it into precision. Emma sat through every one of those sessions, without ever once flinching at my frustration, without ever offering the kind of empty encouragement that would have made me want to throw the rubber ball across the room. She'd just say, quietly, again, and wait, and somehow that was exactly the right amount of pressure and none at all. My family visited exactly twice in that first month. Both visits, my father brought up the restaurant's finances before he asked how the surgery had gone. The second time, my mother sat beside my bed and held my good hand and told me, with what I genuinely believe she intended as comfort, that at least this happened to your hand and not your whole life. You can still be useful in other ways at the practice. I didn't have the energy that day to explain to her why that sentence hurt considerably more than she seemed to understand it would. The pressure sharpened considerably once it became clear medically that I wouldn't be returning to full surgical practice anytime soon. "You're not even operating right now," my father said, on his third visit, standing at the foot of my hospital bed with an ease that made it obvious he'd rehearsed the line. "That money's just sitting there while your brother's business is genuinely at risk. I don't understand what you're protecting it for." "I'm protecting it for what Grandpa asked me to do with it," I said. "That hasn't changed just because my hand did." "Your grandfather," he said, "would want his grandsons to help each other, not one of you sitting on money while the other one's restaurant goes under." "Is that actually what's happening, going under?" He didn't answer that directly, which told me more than any answer would have. I didn't know at the time that Tucker's gambling debts had grown to a size that made the renovation loan look almost incidental by comparison. That the capital gap my father kept describing was, in significant part, money Tucker had quietly pulled from the restaurant's own operating accounts over 18 months to cover markers at that casino 2 hours up the coast. Money my father had discovered roughly a year earlier, and had spent that entire year concealing rather than confronting. The confrontation that finally forced everything into the open happened on a Tuesday afternoon, 6 months to the day after my accident, in a small exam room at the rehabilitation clinic, where I'd spent 3 sessions a week rebuilding whatever function my hand was going to have left. My father arrived unannounced, halfway through a session, carrying a manila folder I recognized instantly. The same kind he'd carried to that long-ago dinner about the trust, the same careful, deliberate weight in how he set it on the exam table. "I need you to sign this today," he said without preamble, sliding the folder toward me while my occupational therapist glanced up in visible confusion. "It's a release for the trust funds. Tucker's attorney drew it up. We're out of time, the bank's calling the loan due at the end of the month if we can't show additional capital." "I'm in the middle of a session, Dad. This is more important than a session." "It's not more important to me." I kept my voice even, aware of watching, aware of my own hand, still wrapped in its brace, resting on the table between us. "I told you months ago, this money isn't restaurant money. It was never going to be restaurant money. Your brother is going to lose everything your grandfather built," my father said, his voice rising for the first time. "And you're sitting there with a hand you're not even using anymore, protecting a fund for some clinic that doesn't exist yet, that might never exist, over your own family's business." "Watch how you're talking about his hand," Emma said quietly from the doorway, where she'd arrived a few minutes into the session, as she did most Tuesdays. My father barely glanced at her. "This isn't your family, Emma." "It will be," she said, "and I'm not going anywhere." "Dad," I said, trying to keep my voice level, "has it occurred to you that maybe Tucker's the one who should be sitting here, explaining to me why a renovation loan spiraled this far out of control? Why is it my hand on this table and not his?" "Because you're the one with money doing nothing," he said. "That's not complicated. It's not doing nothing, it's doing exactly what Grandpa asked." My father ignored her. "Sign it." "No." That was when he reached across the table and closed his hand around my wrist. I don't fully remember the sequence of the next several seconds, the pain arriving first, blinding and total, the sound I made that didn't feel like it belonged to me, his clipboard clattering to the floor as she moved fast toward us, Emma already crossing the room with her phone raised, the recording light glowing. I remember my father's grip finally releasing, and the particular, awful clarity of looking down at my hand and understanding, with a trauma surgeon's cold professional certainty even through my own panic, that something inside the healing tissue had almost certainly just torn. "Get off him," Emma said again, and this time she was between us, physically, her whole body angled to put herself in the space my father would have had to move through to reach me again. Had already reached the wall phone, calling for the clinic's on-call physician and, separately, for security. My father stood very still, breathing hard, looking at Emma's phone with an expression that shifted over the space of a few seconds from anger into something more calculating. The same look I remembered from every negotiation I'd ever watched him lose ground in. "This is a family matter," he said. "Nobody needs to be calling anyone." "You just assaulted a patient in a medical facility," said, not looking up from the phone. This stopped being a family matter the moment you put your hands on him. The clinic's physician arrived within minutes, examined my hand, and ordered an emergency imaging study that confirmed what I already suspected: a partial re-tear of the repaired ligament, an injury that would require, at minimum, a third surgery and a significantly longer recovery timeline than the one I'd already spent 6 exhausting months climbing toward. Clinic security detained my father in the waiting area until Savannah police arrived, called by the front desk the moment report of the incident reached them. I gave my statement sitting in that same exam room, my hand already swelling visibly beneath the brace, Emma's hand resting on my shoulder the entire time. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to. I had a documented surgical history establishing exactly what my hand had been recovering from, an emergency imaging study establishing exactly what had just been done to it, and the clinic physician as direct witnesses, and, on Emma's phone, video of my father's hand closing around my wrist and the sound I'd made when he wrenched it. What none of us knew yet, sitting in that room, was how much further the evidence would reach once the investigation actually opened. I had started, roughly 2 months earlier, quietly recording every financial conversation with my father, at the suggestion of a friend from law school who'd heard enough secondhand about the pressure campaign to gently suggest that a man who kept escalating his demands might eventually escalate further than words. I hadn't wanted to believe that suggestion at the time. I'd made the recordings anyway, the same instinct for documentation that had made me a careful surgeon translating itself into a careful son, keeping a record of exactly what was being asked of me and how. Those recordings, once I handed them over to the detective assigned to the case, established a clear pattern of escalating pressure over months, including one conversation, recorded 3 weeks before the incident, in which my father could be heard telling Tucker on speakerphone, apparently forgetting or not caring that I was still on the line, "I'll handle. He'll come around once he understands what's actually at stake here." A line the prosecutor would later use to establish that the confrontation in the rehab clinic had not been a sudden loss of temper, but the culmination of a deliberate, sustained campaign. It was Tucker, in the end, who broke the case open completely. He came to see me alone, 10 days after the incident, while my hand was still in a post-surgical splint from the third operation, sitting in my apartment's kitchen with an expression I hadn't seen on him since we were kids, something close to genuine shame. He told me everything: the casino, the markers, the 18 months of skimmed operating funds, the year our father had spent covering for him rather than confronting him, the increasingly desperate pressure campaign aimed at my trust fund that had, in reality, never had anything to do with a renovation loan at all. "How much?" I asked him once he'd finished, my voice quieter than I expected it to come out. "A little over 200,000, across almost 2 years. I kept telling myself I'd win it back before anyone noticed." He looked down at his hands, the same easy, capable hands our father had always trusted with the restaurant's books. "Dad found out about 11 months ago. He didn't yell. He just started figuring out how to cover it without anyone else knowing. That's when the pressure on you really started, I think. He needed a number to appear, and you were the only number he could see." "I should have told you the second Dad started this," Tucker said. "I let him do it because some part of me wanted the money to just appear so I wouldn't have to actually deal with what I'd done. That's on me. All of it's on me." He gave a full statement to investigators the following week, providing financial records that established the embezzlement independently of anything I'd handed over, and agreed to testify, if it came to that, about the pressure campaign he'd watched our father run against me for months without intervening. The detective assigned to the case, a patient, methodical woman named Sargent, told me during one of our follow-up interviews that cases like ours rarely came together this cleanly. "Usually," she said, "families closed ranks long enough to make everything difficult to prove." Between the recordings, the medical documentations, report Emma's video, and now Tucker's full financial disclosure, she said this was, professionally speaking, about as thorough a case file as she'd built in years. It came to that. My father was charged with assault, and once the financial records surfaced, with conspiracy connected to the concealment of Tucker's embezzlement, given evidence that he'd not only known about the missing funds for over a year but had actively helped obscure them from the restaurant's account. Tucker, cooperating fully with investigators from the start, was charged separately with the embezzlement itself, but received substantially reduced consequences in recognition of his cooperation: a felony conviction, restitution obligations that would take him years to satisfy, and a probationary sentence rather than time served. I sat 2 rows behind the prosecutor's table on the day my father's plea hearing was finally scheduled, Emma's hand in my left one, my right still stiff inside its post-surgical brace. He didn't look at me when he was brought in. He looked, for most of the hearing, at a point somewhere on the wall above the judge's bench, the same careful, controlled blankness he'd worn his entire life whenever a room contained more truth than he wanted to acknowledge. When the judge read the terms of his plea aloud, the suspended sentence, the probation, the restitution figures, the mandatory anger management program, I found myself listening less for the specifics and more for some flicker of the man who used to pat me on the shoulder and say good work in that flat, distracted voice, some sign that any of this had actually reached him. I didn't find it. I'm not sure, honestly, that I expected to. Cole's catch closed 11 weeks after my father's arrest. Unable to survive both the reputational damage of a very public embezzlement case and the operating capital that had, in reality, never existed the way my father had spent years insisting it did. A Savannah Morning News segment covered the closure with the particular tone local news reserves for a beloved institution's fall from grace. And for a while I couldn't walk past a certain stretch of the waterfront without someone recognizing the name on the old sign and asking carefully whether I was related. The waterfront building in my family for 3 generations was sold to cover the restitution owed to the restaurant's own creditors, and eventually to me. My father received a suspended sentence contingent on a lengthy probation and mandatory restitution for both the assault and his role in the concealment. My mother, investigators determined, had known enough to be uncomfortable but not enough to be charged. I filed for a protective order against my father, which was granted without contest, given the medical documentation alone. My mother called me once, a few weeks after the plea hearing, and asked if we could talk in person. We met at a coffee shop, not the one my father had chosen for that conversation about the trust years earlier, some neutral ground neither of us had any history with. She looked older than I remembered, or maybe I simply hadn't let myself look closely enough in a long time. I knew things weren't right for longer than I ever admitted, she told me, turning her cup slowly on the table without drinking from it. I told myself it was easier to believe your father when he said he was handling it. I think some part of me didn't want to know what handling it actually meant. I didn't have anything comforting to offer her that day, and I don't think she was expecting me to. She filed for divorce 4 months later. My third surgery healed slower than the first 2, and the surgeon who repaired it told me, with the same gentle honesty as before, that the additional damage from that afternoon in the rehab clinic had likely closed the door permanently on returning to the kind of fine surgical work I'd once done. I spent a long stretch of months afterward grieving something I hadn't fully let myself grieve the first time around, and Emma sat with me through that the same way she'd sat with me through everything else, never once suggesting there was a faster or tidier way to get through it. There was a particular week, roughly 4 months after that third surgery, when the grief finally caught up with everything else all at once. The hand, the trial preparation, the strange, hollowed-out feeling of watching my own father's appear in a local news story I couldn't stop myself from reading. I remember sitting on the floor of our apartment's kitchen one evening, unable to explain to Emma exactly what was wrong beyond the fact that everything was, and her sitting down on the floor across from me without a word, close enough that our knees touched, waiting until I was ready to talk instead of asking me to be ready sooner than I was. I think that week, more than any single moment in the courtroom, was when I actually understood the difference between the family I'd been born into and the family I was, quietly and without much ceremony, actually choosing. I used my grandfather's trust the following spring, exactly the way he'd asked me to, without ever knowing how directly his instructions would end up guiding me through the worst year of my life. The clinic opened 18 months after the accident, 3 blocks from where Cole's Catch used to stand, a small community trauma and urgent care center with Frank's name on the door in the same simple lettering he'd used on the restaurant's original sign, salvaged and remounted from the building before it was sold. On opening day, an older man I didn't recognize came in for a minor laceration on his forearm, and while I was cleaning it, he glanced up at the name on the wall and asked, almost idly, whether I was any relation to old Frank Cole who used to run the seafood place down the block. I told him I was his grandson. He nodded slowly, the way people do when a piece of a place's history settles back into shape for them, and said, "Good man, your grandfather. Fed my whole family through some lean years and never once made it feel like charity." I didn't tell him the rest of it. I just said thank you, and finished the stitches, and thought about how strange and quietly perfect it was that the last thing anyone in this town would remember about my family's name was exactly the thing my grandfather had spent his whole life trying to be worthy of. I don't operate there. My hand, steadier now than it was but never quite what it used to be, isn't built for that kind of precision anymore. I teach instead, and I see patients in the urgent care rooms, and twice a week I sit with new trauma residents and walk them through exactly the kind of decision-making that had once been trained into my own hands, back when they still worked the way they used to. I used to believe that the distance between my father and me was just the ordinary friction of two people who wanted different lives. I know now that the friction was never about the restaurant, or the trust, or even really about medicine versus fish and chips on a waterfront menu. It was about a man who only ever measured love in terms of what it cost him to give it, standing across from a son who had, without ever quite meaning to, become exactly the kind of person his own father had spent a lifetime trying to become worthy of. I stand at the harbor most evenings now, after clinic hours, near the spot where my grandfather nearly drowned 60 years before I was born, and I watch the water go from gold to gray the way it did on every one of the 1,000 evenings he must have watched it from that same stretch of shoreline. My hand doesn't ache out there the way it does some morning. It just rests, quiet, capable of considerably less than it used to be, and somehow, in every way that actually matters, considerably more than enough. Emma and I got married the following spring, a small ceremony at the harbor itself, close enough to the water that you could hear it under the vows. My mother came, sitting alone in the second row, and cried in a way that felt, for the first time in years, uncomplicated. Tucker came too. It took both of us a long time to sit comfortably in the same room again, but he shows up now, consistently in the smaller, steadier ways that actually mean something, helping me with paperwork when my hand gets tired. Driving up from the apartment he rents now above a bar 2 blocks from where the restaurant used to stand, asking every single time how the clinic's doing before he asks about anything else. He's 2 years into a gambling recovery program now, sober from the tables the same length of time, and he keeps a small, framed photo of our grandfather on his nightstand. He told me once, "So I remember what actually being a Cole is supposed to look like." My father wasn't invited. I don't know if he expected to be. I heard, through my mother, that he moved to a smaller town further down the coast after the divorce, working, of all things, as a line cook at a restaurant that isn't his own for the first time in his adult life. I don't know what he thinks about, standing at a stove that belongs to somebody else. I've stopped spending much energy wondering. Some evenings, closing up after the last patients left, I think about the version of myself who sat across from my father in that exam room and said no, cert even then that it would cost him something he wasn't willing to lose gracefully. I didn't know yet how much it would cost me too. I know now, though, the way my grandfather seemed to know most things eventually, that the cost was never really the question that mattered. The question was always just whether I'd spend my life being useful to people who deserved it, or useful to people who only ever wanted what my hands could do for them. I know which one I chose. I think somewhere he does too.